Have you ever wondered why humans look the way they do? Why our skin carries the silent story of survival beneath the sun? Tonight we journey back tens of thousands of years to a world untouched by cities, tools, or written history. A world where humanity's first great adaptation was quietly forged on the African plains. Dark skin, one of evolution's earliest inventions, protected life itself long before civilization began. If you want to drift even deeper into the mysteries of our distant past, join this channel, subscribe, and let us carry you into stories the history books never recorded, where every detail whispers the secrets of human survival. Long before skin carried meaning, before colour mattered at all, the first humans lived wrapped in a very different body. Their ancestors walked beneath an African sky that felt vast and unfamiliar, a sun that burned bright and steady day after day. Yet their bodies were not shaped to meet that light directly. Thick hair covered most of their skin, forming a natural layer between flesh and heat, much like other mammals that shared the plains and woodlands. In this early world, bare skin was rare and exposure was limited. Survival depended less on the surface of the body and more on movement, cooperation, and awareness of danger. These early humans did not yet think of the sun as a threat. It was simply part of the background of life, rising and setting with dependable rhythm. Shade could be found beneath trees, along riverbanks, or inside shallow shelters made of branches and leaves. The hair on their bodies trapped a thin layer of air close to the skin, reducing the direct impact of heat and helping regulate temperature during long days of walking. At night, that same covering provided warmth as temperatures dropped. Their skin beneath the hair remained relatively light, not because it was meant to be seen, but because it had never needed to change. Life unfolded slowly. Generations passed without dramatic shifts, each one inheriting the same general form as the last. Children were born, learned to walk, learned to follow, learned to forage. The sun watched silently as these lives repeated themselves, unaware that it would one day become a powerful force shaping the human body. At this stage, evolution had not yet turned its attention to skin. Other challenges mattered more: finding food, avoiding predators, enduring droughts and sudden storms. The landscape itself was in motion, even if change felt imperceptible within a single lifetime. Africa was not a single environment but a mosaic of grasslands, forests, and open savannas. As climate subtly shifted, resources moved and early humans followed. Walking longer distances became normal. Endurance mattered. Cooling the body during sustained movement slowly became more important than staying warm at rest. Still, hair remained useful, and skin stayed hidden. The sun continued to shine with the same intensity it always had, but the relationship between humans and their environment was quietly changing. Movement across open ground increased exposure. Time spent beneath direct light grew longer. Yet for now, hair absorbed much of the impact. The skin underneath remained largely protected, spared from the full force of ultraviolet radiation. No immediate pressure existed to alter pigmentation. Nature does not rush when patience works. What defined these early humans was not appearance, but adaptability. Their bodies were experiments in progress, shaped by countless small advantages rather than sudden transformations. Evolution worked invisibly, selecting what functioned well enough to last another generation. At this moment in the story, light skin was not a vulnerability, nor was it a strength. It was simply a starting point, inherited without question. Unknowingly, these early humans stood at the edge of a long transition. The sun above them had always been powerful, but its influence had not yet reached beneath the fur that shielded their skin. That balance would not last forever. Changes were already beginning, slow and subtle, written not in a single lifetime but across thousands of years. For now, the story remained quiet, resting in a time when skin was unseen, and the sun had not yet demanded an answer from the human body. As generation continued to pass, the land itself began to ask new things of the human body. Forests thinned, open spaces widened, and the air grew warmer and drier in many regions. What once had been a comfortable covering slowly turned into a burden. Thick hair, which had trapped warmth so effectively before, now held heat in for too long. Long walks under an open sky became exhausting, and bodies overheated more easily during the hottest hours of the day. Those who could release heat more efficiently found it easier to move, to hunt, and to endure the long journeys between water and food. Cooling became the quiet challenge of survival. Sweating, still limited in heavily furred bodies, offered a hint of a solution. Over time, individuals with slightly less body hair lost heat more effectively. They recovered faster after exertion and could remain active when others had to stop. These advantages were small, almost invisible, but in nature, small advantages accumulate. The loss of fur did not happen suddenly, and it did not happen evenly. Patches thinned first, then expanded, generation by generation. Hair retreated from areas most exposed to heat and exertion. With each change, the human body became more dependent on the skin itself to manage temperature. Sweat glands became more active, turning evaporation into a powerful cooling tool. Movement under the sun grew easier and endurance improved. Yet this new freedom came with an unexpected cost. For the first time, large areas of human skin were directly exposed to daylight. What had once been filtered through layers of hair now reached the surface without resistance. The sun was no longer just warmth and light. It became a force acting directly on flesh. Sunburns, irritation, and long-term damage quietly increased, though early humans had no language to describe these sensations as anything more than discomfort or weakness. This was a turning point, though no one living through it could have recognized it as such. The body had traded one kind of protection for another form of efficiency. Cooling meant survival, but exposure meant risk. Evolution rarely offers perfect solutions. It reshapes problems rather than eliminating them. As fur receded, the skin beneath, once largely irrelevant, became the front line between the body and the environment. Children were born with slightly different bodies than their parents, and those differences mattered more now. Skin that responded better to constant sunlight offered subtle benefits, even if the reasons were not understood. Damage accumulated slowly, often appearing later in life, but its effects could still shape survival and reproduction. The sun's influence extended beyond comfort, quietly interacting with cells, blood, and biological processes that early humans could not see. Despite these risks, the advantages of shedding fur were too great to reverse. Humans became creatures of endurance, capable of traveling long distances in the heat while many animals rested. This ability opened new ways of living, tracking animals over time, gathering scattered resources, and expanding into open landscapes that once seemed hostile. Bare skin, once rare, became increasingly common. The human body was changing its relationship with the sun, step by careful step. What began as a solution to heat would soon demand another adaptation in return. The surface of the body, newly exposed, was about to become one of the most important evolutionary frontiers humans had ever known. With the body now open to the sky, the sun began to leave marks that went far beyond surface discomfort. Days spent moving across open ground brought more than warmth. They brought injury that could not always be seen. Skin reddened and cracked, wounds healed slowly, fatigue set in more deeply after long exposure. What had once felt like a constant companion in the sky gradually revealed a harsher side, acting on the body in ways no early human could understand or explain. Inside the skin, invisible damage accumulated. The energy carried by sunlight disrupted the smallest building blocks of life, interfering with the careful copying of cells. Mistakes appeared where none had existed before. Over time, these errors weakened bodies, shortened lifespans, and reduced the chance of producing healthy offspring. The effects were not dramatic or immediate. They unfolded quietly, often long after the day's heat had faded. This made the danger difficult to recognize, yet no less real. Certain individuals fared better than others. Some recovered more easily from long days under the sun. Their skin resisted injury, and their bodies maintained strength longer into adulthood. Pregnancies were more successful, infants more likely to survive their earliest years. These differences were subtle, but in a world where survival rested on narrow margins, subtle differences shaped the future. The sun now acted as a constant filter, shaping which bodies endured and which did not. It did not strike suddenly like a predator or famine. Instead, it applied pressure every day, across every season, across every generation. Each hour of exposure mattered. Each long walk beneath an open sky became part of an unspoken test. Communities adapted behaviorally at first. People sought shade when possible, rested during the brightest hours, and favoured early mornings or evenings for movement. But behaviour alone could not fully escape the sun's reach. Food, water, and opportunity often lay far from shelter. Exposure was unavoidable, and so the body itself began to carry the burden of defence. Over generations, the sun reshaped humanity without announcing its presence. It influenced who lived long enough to teach, to lead, to reproduce. Those whose bodies managed its effects more effectively left more descendants, even if the reasons were never visible. The skin, once a passive boundary, became an active participant in survival. What made this pressure especially powerful was its consistency. Unlike changing climates or sudden disasters, the sun was relentless. It rose every day with the same intensity, offering no negotiation. Evolution responded not with dramatic leaps, but with gradual refinements, tiny biological shifts that accumulated slowly, shaping populations over immense spans of time. The relationship between humans and the sun had changed permanently. No longer merely a source of light and warmth, it became a force that demanded adaptation. The challenge was clear, even if it was not yet understood: survive beneath the sun or quietly disappear. The solution would emerge not through tools or shelter alone, but through changes written directly into the human body itself. The answer did not arrive suddenly, and it did not announce itself. It emerged quietly, carried within the smallest variations between one body and the next. In some individuals, the skin responded differently to constant sunlight. Cells began producing slightly higher amounts of a natural pigment that absorbed and scattered harmful radiation before it could reach deeper tissues. At first, the change was barely noticeable, a faint deepening of tone that held no meaning beyond its function. This pigment acted like a filter, intercepting energy that would otherwise disrupt the delicate processes inside the body. Where it was more abundant, damage accumulated more slowly. Skin remained stronger. Cellular repair worked more reliably. These advantages did not make anyone faster or stronger in obvious ways, but they extended resilience. Over long lives lived outdoors, that resilience mattered. Children born with this subtle protection were more likely to reach adulthood in good health. Their bodies endured repeated exposure with fewer long-term consequences. Over time, these children became parents, and their traits quietly passed forward. No generation noticed a sharp divide between themselves and those who came before. Change unfolded so slowly that it felt like continuity rather than transformation. What mattered was not appearance, but function. The pigment did not exist to create identity or difference. It existed because it worked. Nature favoured solutions that required no conscious effort, no behaviour to learn, no shelter to build. This adaptation travelled within the body itself, present at birth, active every day. As generations stretched into millennia, the accumulation of these small changes reshaped entire populations. Skin tones gradually deepened, especially in regions where sunlight struck with greatest intensity. This was not uniform or immediate. Variation remained, but the overall direction was clear. The balance between exposure and protection shifted in favour of survival. The process was slow enough to avoid disruption. There was no single moment when humanity changed course. Instead, countless lifetimes blended together, each contributing a fraction of progress. Evolution rarely rushes, it refines. The rise of this pigment was a lesson in patience, demonstrating how powerful gradual change can be when guided by consistent pressure. Importantly, this adaptation did not isolate humans from their environment. It allowed continued movement, endurance, and exploration under open skies. The body could now meet the sun more directly without paying the same hidden costs as before. Life continued across wide landscapes, sustained by a form of protection that required no tools and left no trace in the archaeological record. By the time darker skin became common, it felt natural, unremarkable, and permanent. No memory remained of a time when it was otherwise. What had begun as a faint biological adjustment became a defining feature, shaped not by intention but by necessity. This was not an endpoint, but a foundation. The body had answered one challenge: securing a future beneath a powerful sun. That answer would echo forward, influencing every step humanity took from this point on, carrying with it the quiet proof that survival is often decided by the smallest, most patient changes of all. The benefits of this slow transformation became evident in ways that early humans could never articulate. Those whose skin carried more pigment moved under the sun with fewer consequences. Burns that once left open sores now occurred rarely, and the relentless toll of ultraviolet radiation was softened by the protective layer within the skin. Cells could replicate with fewer errors, preserving the integrity of bodies in ways invisible to the eye. Life became more predictable, if not easier, for those who carried these subtle advantages. Pregnancy, a delicate and critical stage of human life, became safer in this new balance. Folate, a vital nutrient for the development of the brain and spine, remained more stable when skin was shielded from excessive radiation. Mothers endured the sun's glare with fewer complications, and infants emerged healthier and stronger. Survival rates edged upward, imperceptibly at first, then increasingly over generations. Every successful birth reinforced the presence of protective traits, passing them quietly into the next lineage. The advantages extended beyond reproduction. Adults with darker skin could travel longer distances without debilitating burns or fatigue, improving their ability to hunt, forage, and explore. Communities thrived when more members remained healthy into middle and old age, able to teach, share knowledge, and carry the burdens of survival. Protection from the sun became a hidden engine of endurance, subtly guiding who lived long enough to influence their surroundings. Nature's measure of success was not dramatic. It worked quietly, not through sudden leaps but through repetition across countless lifetimes. Individuals who fared poorly under the sun often did not survive long enough to reproduce as successfully, while those with enhanced pigmentation endured and multiplied. Over time, the composition of populations shifted in a way that reflected the pressures of daily life, written not in stone or artifact but on living bodies. The effect was cumulative. Each generation inherited not just a physical trait, but a pattern of survival. Communities in the sun-scorched landscapes of Africa gradually carried this invisible advantage collectively. Skin tone, once inconsequential, became a silent ledger of resilience, encoding a history of endurance and adaptation. Every face, every arm, every hand carried the story of countless days spent beneath relentless skies. This was evolution in motion, subtle and patient. The human body had found a way to meet a relentless force with quiet strength. Darker skin was not merely a shield, it was a mark of continuity, a sign that life had persisted where it might have faltered. The survival of individuals had begun to define the survival of entire communities, establishing patterns that would echo for millennia to come. In time, this adaptation set the stage for future generations to explore broader landscapes with confidence. The challenges posed by the sun remained, but the human body was now equipped with a first line of defense written into every cell. Life continued, stronger, more durable, and more capable, proving that sometimes the most important changes are those that happen quietly, leaving their trace not in monuments or records, but in the flesh itself. Beneath the surface, the story of survival deepened in ways that could not be seen with the naked eye. Dark skin did more than prevent burns or preserve energy. It quietly safeguarded the very building blocks of life within. Folate, a vitamin circulating in the blood, played a role so critical that any loss could alter the course of a lifetime. It shaped the formation of the spine and the development of the brain, guiding growth in ways subtle yet profound. Without sufficient protection, ultraviolet light threatened to deplete this essential nutrient, leaving individuals more vulnerable to complications that could influence reproduction and survival. Those whose skin carried more pigment experienced an unseen advantage. Their blood preserved folate more effectively, even under long hours of sunlight. Pregnancies proceeded with fewer complications, and the next generation's neural development benefited from this quiet defense. Brains grew larger, spines formed more reliably, and the foundations of human cognition were strengthened, not through intention, but through natural selection acting over countless lifetimes. What appeared as simply darker skin was, in fact, a safeguard for intelligence and survival, an invisible strategy written into flesh. This protection allowed humans to push their limits in ways that earlier generations could not. Endurance hunting, migration across open landscapes, and the demands of prolonged exposure became possible not just because the skin withstood burns, but because the body's inner systems remained intact. Neural and skeletal development proceeded unimpeded, giving rise to greater capacity for learning, coordination, and problem-solving. Communities became more capable as a result, their members stronger and more adaptable. Evolution operates in layers, often unseen, and here it worked quietly through the interplay of skin, blood, and nutrient. Dark pigmentation was both armor and silent facilitator, allowing survival strategies to flourish while simultaneously laying the groundwork for more complex human capabilities. The advantages were cumulative and long-term. They shaped potential across generations rather than providing immediate, visible rewards. It was a subtle form of engineering, written by nature without guidance or foresight. Every child born with adequate folate benefited from the protective qualities of their own skin, a self-contained system of preservation. Over time, these hidden advantages contributed to a population capable of greater endurance, higher cognition, and more intricate social behaviors. The body had found a way to secure its future in the quietest of ways, by shielding the very substance that allowed the mind to expand. By protecting folate, melanin became more than a pigment. It became a facilitator of human potential. The sun, once a threat, was now balanced by a natural shield that allowed exploration, growth, and the slow accumulation of knowledge. Dark skin was not merely a response to the environment, it was a partner in the evolution of the mind, laying the foundation for a species that would one day build, invent, and imagine far beyond the limitations of survival alone. In this way, the story of human adaptation was not only about facing heat or light, it was about nurturing what would become the essence of humanity itself. The quiet chemistry of blood and vitamins, safeguarded by melanin, carried forward the seeds of intelligence, endurance, and resilience, forming a legacy that would echo in every generation to come. In the heart of equatorial Africa, where the sun ruled the sky with relentless intensity, dark skin became more than an adaptation. It became the standard of survival. Generations spent under its glare shaped communities in ways no tool or shelter could replicate. The landscapes were unforgiving, open savannas, shimmering heat waves over grasslands, and skies so bright that even a brief exposure could mark the flesh. In this environment, lighter skin offered no advantage. It exposed the body to injury and long-term damage. Dark pigmentation, however, acted as a natural armor, a continuous, invisible protection woven into every cell. As populations grew and spread across diverse terrains within these equatorial zones, the predominance of darker skin became absolute. It was no longer a rare variation or a subtle trait. It was the signature of life adapted perfectly to the land. Children were born into it, their survival quietly reinforced by the protection it afforded. Daily life, once fraught with the dangers of sun exposure, became more sustainable. Adults could travel farther in search of water and food, tend to their communities, and endure the heat without suffering the immediate or cumulative consequences that had once plagued their ancestors. The shift was biological, not aesthetic. Skin tone, though visible, carried a practical story that no words could capture. It told of thousands of years of exposure, of countless decisions shaped by sunlight rather than intention. Each body that carried darker skin was a testament to a silent conversation between the human form and the environment, between survival and risk, endurance and fragility. In every individual, the sun's energy was intercepted, its destructive power diffused, allowing life to continue where it might have faltered. Life under the sun also shaped culture, movement, and behavior. Communities settled in ways that balanced exposure with necessity. Daily routines, hunting patterns, and gathering expeditions were structured around sunlight, yet the constant protection of melanin allowed humans to exploit their environment fully. They could endure midday heat, traverse long distances, and engage with the world with less fear of invisible threats. Their bodies carried the proof of adaptation silently, making extended activity in the equatorial wilderness possible. Over centuries, the shield of dark skin became a defining feature of humanity in these regions. It was a trait selected not by preference or beauty, but by the immutable geography that demanded resilience. Nature had favored a solution that required no thought, no invention, simply a body shaped to meet its surroundings. Each generation inherited this advantage, reinforcing its prevalence until it was nearly universal in the populations that thrived under the harsh African sun. In this way, dark skin was not merely a physical characteristic, It was a record of survival, a living archive of adaptation written directly on human flesh. It testified to the intimate relationship between species and landscape, to the quiet power of evolutionary pressures, and to the remarkable capacity of humans to endure in harmony with one of the planet's most demanding environments. The African sun, once a potential threat, had forged one of humanity's most enduring shields, a legacy that would persist even as populations began to migrate beyond its direct influence. Time stretched across millennia, and with it the slow artistry of evolution unfolded. Each generation inherited not just life, but a subtle record of exposure, endurance, and adaptation. Children were born into a world bathed in relentless sunlight, their skin carrying the invisible lessons of countless ancestors. The tones that once varied from faintly deepened shades to darker hues gradually coalesced, guided by the constant pressure of the equatorial sun. Over tens of thousands of years, these subtle differences merged into a stable spectrum, one that reflected survival rather than choice. The process was almost imperceptible to those living it. A child with slightly more protection than a sibling might thrive more fully, but the reasons remained unseen. Over centuries, these quiet advantages accumulated generation after generation. The sun sculpted humanity not with immediate force, but with patient insistence, shaping bodies in ways that became increasingly refined. Every individual was both a product and a participant in this ongoing work, a living canvas upon which light left its mark. Skin became a medium of survival, its tone a mirror of environmental necessity. It absorbed, diffused, and moderated energy in a way that preserved the inner workings of the body, allowing neural development, reproductive success, and physical endurance to proceed with fewer interruptions. Communities across the African landscape gradually carried this uniform advantage, their members more resilient under the daily glare of sunlight. Variation persisted, but the overall pattern had settled into a reliable and consistent form, a testament to the quiet but relentless pressure of nature. Beyond protection, this stability allowed humans to interact with their environment in new ways. Movement across long distances, sustained foraging, and the observation of patterns in animals and weather were all possible because the body could withstand exposure without the constant threat of cellular damage. Darker skin was not merely a shield, it was a tool for exploring, for surviving, for understanding the world at a pace and scale that had been impossible in earlier generations. As generations accumulated, the pattern became self-reinforcing. Individuals whose skin carried optimal protection survived and reproduced more consistently. Their descendants inherited these traits, and those traits became more prevalent across the population. By the time tens of thousands of years had passed, the work of the sun was complete in its slow, methodical way. Skin tones had stabilized, reflecting a delicate balance between exposure and defense, between environmental pressure and biological response. In this vast sweep of time, sunlight emerged as a sculpture of humanity itself, tracing lines across flesh, blood, and bone with relentless consistency. The human body was not a passive subject, but an active participant in this enduring dialogue. Each generation carried forward the legacy of survival, painted by light, preserved by nature, and etched into the very essence of what it meant to endure under the unyielding African sun. The story of skin was, in this way, inseparable from the story of life itself, a slow, patient testament to the power of time, light, and the quiet hand of evolution. As time passed, some groups of humans began to wander beyond the familiar rhythms of Africa. Rivers, valleys, and coastal plains guided migrations, leading individuals into landscapes where the sun no longer burned with the same intensity. Grasslands gave way to forests, open savannas to rolling hills, and the exposure that had once demanded constant protection now diminished. The very trait that had ensured survival under relentless sunlight, dark skin, suddenly faced a world where its advantages were less pressing, and new pressures began to emerge. Travelling into these regions, humans encountered longer winters, shorter growing seasons, and stretches of clouded skies that softened the sunlight. Vitamin D, which the body synthesizes under ultraviolet rays, became more difficult to produce through thickly pigmented skin. What had once been a safeguard in equatorial Africa now slowed the body's access to essential nutrients. Survival demanded balance. The same shield that had preserved folate and prevented burns in one environment could hinder health in another. Nature's pressures were shifting with geography, rewriting the rules of endurance and adaptation. Communities adjusted in subtle ways, movement patterns changed. Diet became more varied to compensate for reduced sunlight. Exposure to the sky was no longer constant, and human bodies began to face new challenges. Those born with slightly lighter skin found it easier to absorb the diminished ultraviolet rays, producing enough vitamin D to maintain strong bones, immune systems, and reproductive health. Over generations, these slight advantages shaped the course of survival in northern climates, quietly altering the trajectory that had been established under Africa's fierce sun. Migration brought more than environmental change. It introduced new ecosystems, different foods, and varied seasonal rhythms. Humans had to adjust not only their behavior but their biology to match the slower accumulation of sunlight and shifting availability of resources. In some ways, the journey marked the beginning of a more complex interplay between body, landscape, and climate. The selective pressures that had been straightforward under Africa's equatorial glare now became layered and multifaceted, guiding evolution in directions that no one could foresee. This period set the stage for gradual transformations that would unfold over thousands of years. Populations that settled in northern and temperate regions slowly exhibited changes in skin tone, reflecting a delicate compromise between the need for protection and the need to harness sunlight for essential processes. The story of dark skin, once a universal marker of resilience in Africa, became more variable, influenced by distance, climate, and exposure. Yet even as humans moved into weaker sunlight, the legacy of the sun in Africa remained written in their bodies. Dark skin continued to carry the memory of survival, a testament to countless generations shaped by relentless light. Migration did not erase that history, it layered it, introducing new challenges while preserving the echoes of adaptation. Humanity was learning, generation by generation, that survival depended not only on the traits of the past, but on the capacity to respond to the ever-changing demands of the world. In leaving Africa, humans carried with them both the protection that had ensured life and the beginning of a new evolutionary story, one that would unfold under skies far less familiar. Long before the first stone tools were shaped by hand, long before settlements rose along rivers, or the first words were spoken to organize thought, the human body carried a solution to one of its most pressing challenges. Dark skin was not decorative, not symbolic, and not conscious in its purpose. It was a technology crafted by the slow, patient hands of evolution. Each cell, each strand of pigment, served as a barrier against a threat that had no regard for strength, ingenuity, or cleverness. In this sense, the body itself had become the earliest tool, a living mechanism honed for survival under the harsh sun of Africa. This adaptation was silent but profound. Unlike spears or shelters, it required no planning, no instruction, no deliberate effort. It existed because it worked. Individuals who carried it could endure longer, travel farther, reproduce more reliably, and pass these advantages to their descendants. Communities stabilized and thrived because their members were physically equipped to meet the environment head-on. Dark skin did not simply protect, it enabled action, movement, and resilience on a scale that had never been necessary before. The significance of this adaptation becomes even clearer when viewed across the sweep of prehistory. Human history is often told through the artifacts we leave behind, the inventions that mark progress. Yet here was a survival strategy that predates all of that. It shaped life in ways invisible to the eye but fundamental to the continuity of the species. Every birth, every season survived, and every child who reached maturity carried the proof of this quiet triumph. Civilization itself would later depend on the endurance that this early adaptation allowed, forming the foundation for everything humans would eventually build. Dark skin was more than a shield. It was a demonstration of how life responds to persistent challenge. It balanced internal chemistry, protected reproductive success, and preserved the potential for intelligence to flourish. Without it, early humans would have been far more vulnerable to the same sunlight that bathed the landscapes they called home. Their capacity to explore, to migrate, to learn from the world around them, and ultimately to shape it in turn, depended in part on the subtle pigment woven into their flesh. Even as humanity eventually spread to distant lands, and as variations in skin tone emerged in response to new environments, the original adaptation retained its significance. It stands as a reminder that survival often relies on innovations that cannot be carved, built, or written, but must exist within the very body itself. Before fire, before shelter, before speech, the first great human technology was already present, a living, responsive, and enduring defense against one of nature's most relentless forces. In this light, dark skin emerges as more than biology. It is the story of ingenuity without intention, of resilience without design, and of a species shaped from its earliest days by a challenge it could not escape. It is the quiet triumph of evolution, a foundation on which all of humanity's later achievements would rest, and a testament to the enduring power of life to meet adversity, adapt, and endure. Long before any human breath warmed the air, the planet moved in a way that felt undecided, as if it had not yet chosen what it wanted to become. The land did not rest. Continents crept and collided, tearing open mountains and swallowing seas. Volcanoes spoke more often than living creatures, and their ash drifted across skies that changed colour without warning. Rain could vanish for centuries, then return with enough force to erase entire regions. Nothing about this world suggested stability, and nothing about it hinted that a thinking species was expected to arrive. Life existed everywhere, yet nowhere did it seem secure. Forests expanded, then retreated. Deserts bloomed briefly with green before turning back to dust. Oceans warmed and cooled in long, uneven rhythms, killing vast populations and allowing others to surge forward in their place. Survival here did not reward foresight or reflection. It favoured speed, armour, poison, and numbers. Creatures that lived well were those that reacted instantly, not those that hesitated to consider possibilities. For hundreds of millions of years, the planet ran this same pattern. Species appeared, adapted just enough to endure, then vanished when the balance shifted again. Some lasted longer than others, but none left a permanent mark. Their bones sank into stone, their existence compressed into thin layers that would one day confuse distant observers. From the outside, the story looked productive, even successful. Life was diverse, abundant, and relentless. Yet it was also forgetful. Nothing learned from one age was carried meaningfully into the next. Intelligence, as humans later defined it, was not a goal written into this system. There was no visible path leading towards self-awareness or abstract thought. Many creatures thrived without anything resembling it. Dinosaurs ruled for ages without questioning their world. Insects built complex societies guided entirely by instinct, unchanged across vast stretches of time. Even mammals, clever in small ways, survived primarily by hiding, fleeing, or overpowering rivals. The planet did not seem to reward curiosity. It rewarded fitting in quickly or disappearing entirely. From this perspective, the emergence of a thinking species was not inevitable. It was unlikely. The conditions required for sustained learning, long childhoods, cooperation beyond kin, memory across generations, were fragile traits in a violent environment. Any creature that paused to think risked being eaten. Any body that invested energy in a large brain sacrificed strength elsewhere. Any population that grew slowly faced extinction when disaster arrived suddenly, as it always did. And disaster was constant. Ice sheets advanced without negotiation, grinding landscapes flat and forcing life toward shrinking refuges. Asteroids arrived without warning, rewriting the rules of survival in a single afternoon. Oxygen itself once poisoned the planet, killing most of what lived before it became essential. The Earth had no obligation to protect continuity. It changed because change was what it did. In this long pre-human silence, nothing suggested that reflection, memory, or meaning were necessary additions. The planet functioned without them. Evolution refined bodies into specialized tools, each perfectly shaped for a narrow moment in time. When that moment passed, the tools were discarded. There was no archive of experience, no awareness of loss. Extinction was not a tragedy, it was routine. Seen this way, the later appearance of humans feels less like a planned outcome and more like a question the planet accidentally asked. Why would a system built on efficiency and replacement allow something so slow, so vulnerable, and so uncertain to begin forming? Why risk creating a creature that might not simply adapt to the world, but attempt to understand it? At this early stage, there was no promise that such a risk would pay off. Nothing in Earth's history guaranteed that intelligence would be useful, let alone dominant. It may never have appeared at all, and the planet would have continued turning just the same. Yet somewhere within this unstable, indifferent world, conditions aligned just enough to allow a fragile experiment to begin. One that did not yet know it was an experiment, and one that could still fail without leaving much behind. That quiet, dangerous Earth did not prepare itself for humans. It did not wait for them. It simply continued changing as it always had. And within that motion, evolution took its first uncertain step towards something it had never tried before. When the first of these primates began spending more time on the ground, nothing about the decision looked like progress. The forests they relied on were thinning, breaking into patches separated by open land that offered little cover. Moving between them meant exposure, and exposure on the open ground came with consequences. Tall grasses hid predators. The sun burned without mercy. The safety of branches where danger could often be seen and escaped was replaced by a horizon filled with uncertainty. Standing upright solved one problem while creating several more. It freed the hands, but it placed the most vulnerable parts of the body where teeth and claws could reach them easily. The chest, the throat, the soft belly, areas once protected by 4-point balance and quick climbing now faced forward. Movement became slower and more deliberate. Speed, once a defense, was reduced. Strength did not increase to compensate. There was no sudden advantage to justify the change, only a gradual commitment to a posture that made retreat more difficult. Fur, once a barrier against cold and injury, thinned as bodies changed. Skin became exposed to weather, insects, and sun. Nights grew colder. Days became exhausting. These creatures had not grown sharper claws or longer teeth to offset their vulnerability. They carried no armor. They were not dominant hunters. In almost every physical sense, they became easier to kill. Predators noticed. Big cats, scavengers, and birds of prey did not see a future thinker rising from the grass. They saw prey that could not sprint for long distances and could not climb quickly enough to escape. Survival required constant awareness, yet these primates lacked the instincts that guided other animals effortlessly. Fear alone was no longer enough. Reaction time mattered, and theirs was unremarkable. What made this stage dangerous was not just weakness, but imbalance. Evolution stripped away familiar protections before providing anything new in return. There was no intelligence yet capable of planning or cooperation, no language to warn others, no tools to even the odds. The body had changed first, and the mind lagged behind, leaving a gap where extinction waited patiently. This was not an improvement measured in comfort or safety. It was a narrowing path. Every step taken upright committed the species further, reducing the option to return to the trees. Muscles adapted, bones reshaped, balance shifted permanently. What had started as occasional standing became a defining trait, locking these primates into a form that demanded new solutions they did not yet possess. Food was harder to reach. Roots required digging. Carrion had to be defended or stolen. Scavenging meant arriving late, when stronger animals still lingered nearby. Each meal carried risk. Each injury threatened infection or death. Children required more care than before, unable to cling and travel easily. Groups that could not stay together vanished quickly. There was no grand reward at this stage, only persistence. The broken ape survived not because it was superior, but because it endured long enough for chance to continue working. Populations remained small and scattered, vulnerable to drought, disease, and competition. Many lineages likely ended here, erased before leaving clear traces, their brief experiments in upright life forgotten. What makes this moment remarkable is not that it succeeded, but that it was allowed to continue at all. Evolution rarely protects weakness unless it senses potential, yet here it tolerated a form that was worse at nearly everything it once did well. It was as if the process accepted short-term failure in exchange for an uncertain long-term possibility. Intelligence had not yet arrived to justify the cost. There was no awareness of what was being built. These primates did not know they were changing the future of life on Earth. They were simply responding day by day to a world that no longer supported the old ways. And in doing so, they became something unfinished, no longer well suited for the past, and not yet equipped for what lay ahead. Time did not reward this fragile form with calm. Instead, the world grew harsher. as if testing how much instability it could endure before breaking. Long dry periods stretched across regions that once supported scattered populations, shrinking water sources and thinning the plants and animals they depended on. Rivers shifted course or disappeared entirely. Familiar paths became useless. Groups that failed to move at the right moment found themselves surrounded by emptiness. Cold followed heat with little warning. Ice advanced from the poles, reshaping landscapes and compressing habitable zones into narrow corridors. The air grew drier and sharper. Food became seasonal, then unreliable, then absent. In some eras, volcanic eruptions darkened the sky for years at a time, lowering temperatures and disrupting ecosystems far from the eruption itself. Ash settled into lungs and water sources, turning survival into a daily calculation with no margin for error. During these swings, numbers fell to levels that should have ended the story. Entire regions went silent. What had once been a loose network of related populations collapsed into isolated pockets, separated by distance and hostile terrain. Genetic diversity narrowed. Injuries that might once have been survivable became fatal when help was too far away. Children were born into scarcity, and many never reached maturity. At the lowest points, the total population may have dropped to only a few thousand individuals, not tribes or nations, simply scattered bands clinging to what little remained. This was not dominance. It was persistence measured in small fires kept alive against wind and rain. Any single catastrophe could have erased them entirely. A new pathogen, a failed migration, a prolonged famine. The margin between survival and disappearance was thin enough to vanish without record. Unlike many animals, these early humans could not simply wait out disaster through instinct alone. They required learning, memory, and cooperation, yet these traits were still developing and unreliable. Mistakes were costly. Choosing the wrong season to move or trusting an unstable food source could doom an entire group. There were no second chances, and no backups waiting elsewhere. What is striking is how often the gamble nearly failed. This was not a smooth ascent, but a repeated brush with oblivion. Evolution did not shield this species from pressure, it intensified it. Each environmental shock stripped away the less adaptable, leaving behind those who could tolerate uncertainty, share resources, and endure prolonged stress. Survival favoured not strength, but flexibility. In these bottleneck moments, the future of humanity rested on choices made by individuals who could not have understood their importance. A decision to follow a shoreline instead of an inland route, a willingness to share food rather than hoard it, a tolerance for strangers when isolation would have been safer in the short term. These were not moral choices yet, just practical ones, but they shaped which traits persisted. The danger was not only external. Small populations risked turning inward, losing variation and resilience. Yet movement, however limited, continued. Groups crossed paths. Knowledge in its earliest form passed between them. Simple techniques, habits, and warnings accumulated slowly, fragile as everything else. Unlike physical traits, these could spread faster than genes, offering a narrow advantage in a collapsing world. Still, nothing guaranteed continuation. For long stretches, it would have been reasonable to assume the experiment had failed. Other hominins appeared and vanished. Some were stronger, others faster, some better suited to specific environments. They too struggled against the same forces and often disappeared entirely, leaving only fragments behind. The line leading to modern humans was not obviously superior, only stubbornly present. This was the phase where the risk became undeniable. Evolution had invested time and energy into a creature that repeatedly approached extinction. From a purely efficient perspective, abandoning the attempt would have made sense. Yet the process continued, allowing this vulnerable lineage to pass through catastrophe after catastrophe, altered but not erased. If the story had ended here, the planet would not have noticed the absence. Forest would have regrown, ice would have retreated, new species would have filled the gaps. That it did not end here is what makes this moment stand apart, a point where survival was no longer expected, and continuation itself became the rarest outcome of all. Out of those narrow escapes came a change that made survival even more demanding. The body began redirecting its resources inward, feeding a growing organ that offered no immediate protection. The brain expanded quietly without ceremony, drawing energy away from muscles, immune response, and physical endurance. It did not announce its purpose. It simply demanded more calories, more rest, more time, at a moment when none of those were guaranteed. This shift transformed hunger from an occasional discomfort into a constant presence. To sustain a larger brain, early humans needed richer food, more frequently, and in greater variety. Missing meals was no longer just unpleasant, it became dangerous. Fat reserves were limited. Fasting weakened not only the body but the mind itself. Thinking slowed. Coordination suffered. The very trait that was beginning to set humans apart became the first to fail under stress. Feeding this organ required trade-offs that reshaped the entire life cycle. Growth slowed. Childhood stretched longer than in any other species. Infants were born less developed, their heads too large to allow further maturation before birth. They required years of care before contributing anything in return. During this long dependence, every child represented both hope and risk. Protecting them meant carrying extra weight, sharing scarce food, and delaying movement. Losing them meant wasted investment in an already precarious existence. For groups living at the edge of survival, this was a dangerous commitment. A broken leg or a poor hunting season now threatened not just individuals, but future generations. Other animals matured quickly and reproduced efficiently. Humans did neither. Their strategy depended on surviving long enough for learning to accumulate. But learning took time, and time was something the environment rarely offered. The brain's energy demands also limited physical performance. Endurance existed, but peak strength did not. Recovery from injury was slow. Illness lingered longer. Every calorie burned in thought was a calorie unavailable for immediate survival. In moments of crisis, intelligence did not always help. Overthinking could delay action. Memory could amplify fear. Anticipating danger sometimes weakened resolve rather than sharpening it. At this stage, intelligence was not yet the decisive advantage it would become. It arrived unevenly, without instruction. Curiosity could lead individuals into unfamiliar territory. Experimentation with new foods carried the risk of poisoning. Social complexity introduced conflict, jealousy, and distraction. Awareness of loss and threat added psychological weight unknown to other animals. Survival was no longer only physical, it became emotional and mental as well. Yet the process did not reverse. Once begun, the expansion could not easily be undone. A smaller brain would have meant abandoning the slow accumulation of skills and social memory that was just beginning to form. Evolution accepted the cost and continued the experiment, despite the mounting risks. The organism was becoming less efficient in the short term, betting on benefits that had not fully appeared. This period reshaped how humans related to one another. Dependency increased. Cooperation became less optional. Caring for the young, the injured, and the elderly was no longer an act of excess. It was a requirement for continuity. Knowledge lived within individuals and disappeared when they did. Protecting minds became as important as protecting bodies. The danger remained constant. A run of bad seasons could wipe out decades of slow learning. Entire traditions could vanish with a single generation lost. There was no redundancy yet, no widespread sharing of accumulated experience. Each group carried its own fragile archive, stored in memory rather than stone. In choosing this path, evolution placed humans in a narrow corridor between brilliance and collapse. The brain promised something unprecedented, but it demanded trust before proof. For a long time it made life harder, not easier. Intelligence, still incomplete and unrefined, weighed heavily on a species already burdened by uncertainty. That it survived this stage at all suggests not inevitability, but persistence in the face of an experiment that cost more than it gave, at least at first. Control over fire did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a fragile relationship, one that could be lost as easily as it was gained. At first it was borrowed, not owned, taken from lightning-split trees or smouldering ground and guarded with care that bordered on fear. Flames were unpredictable, capable of warmth and destruction in equal measure. To keep them alive required attention, memory, and cooperation. Fire demanded responsibility long before it offered comfort. Once maintained, its effects reached far beyond heat. Cooked food softened fibers and released energy that raw plants and meat could not easily provide. Meals became easier to digest, allowing more calories to be drawn from the same resources. Jaws and teeth no longer carried the full burden of processing food. The body began to change more slowly now, not because it had reached perfection, but because behavior had started solving problems anatomy once had to address. Fire altered safety in subtle ways. Predators hesitated at its edge. Darkness, once absolute and dangerous, retreated slightly each night. A small circle of light created a boundary where vigilance could relax. Injuries could be tended, tools could be repaired, food could be prepared rather than consumed hastily. The constant urgency of daylight survival loosened its grip, if only for a few hours at a time. Time itself expanded. Nights were no longer periods of enforced stillness. They became extensions of the day, filled with quiet activity and shared presence. In the glow of fire, early humans could look at one another rather than outward for threats. Attention turned inward, toward memory, gesture, and sound. Simple vocalizations gained rhythm and meaning. Experiences from the day could be revisited, not through instinct but through retelling. These gatherings marked a shift no fossil could fully capture. Knowledge began to move more freely between individuals and across generations. Techniques for finding food, avoiding danger, and navigating terrain were no longer rediscovered repeatedly. They were passed along. Mistakes could be warned against before they were made. Successes could be imitated without trial and error. Learning accelerated not through genetic change, but through shared experience. With fire, evolution's focus subtly changed. Physical adaptation slowed, while behavioral flexibility increased. Humans did not grow thicker fur, they learned to control heat. They did not evolve sharper night vision. They created light. They did not wait for teeth to change, they transformed food itself. Problems were no longer addressed solely by waiting for bodies to adapt over generations. They were met with immediate collective solutions. This altered relationship with the environment marked a turning point. Nature was no longer only something to endure. It became something to manage, influence, and occasionally resist. Landscapes could be modified deliberately, controlled burns, cleared undergrowth, and encouraged new plant growth. Campsites became familiar points in a shifting world. Mobility gained structure, guided by memory rather than reaction alone. Fire also deepened social bonds. Keeping it alive required cooperation and trust. Someone had to watch it while others slept. Someone had to gather fuel. Responsibility could be shared, and failure affected everyone. These shared risks and rewards strengthened group cohesion in ways that solitary survival never could. Yet the tool remained dangerous. Misuse could destroy shelter and attract enemies. Dependence on fire introduced new vulnerabilities. Losing it during migration or storms could mean sudden exposure and hunger. Mastery was never complete. It had to be renewed constantly. This tension kept humans alert, balancing benefit against risk. Through fire, humans crossed an invisible boundary. They were no longer shaped solely by the slow pressures of climate and competition. They began shaping their own conditions, even if imperfectly. The world did not stop being dangerous, but it became negotiable. In that flickering light, evolution handed over part of its role, allowing behavior to take the lead where biology once ruled alone. With the mastery of fire and the slow accumulation of shared knowledge, something profound began to emerge. Thoughts started to outweigh instinct. Actions were no longer dictated solely by immediate danger or reflexive drive. Decisions could be deferred, evaluated, and imagined before they were acted upon. Planning became possible, and with it came both opportunity and new vulnerability. The world had always been harsh, but now failure could arise not only from what could be seen, but from what could be imagined. Fear, once a signal of immediate threat, expanded into something larger. A predator hiding in the underbrush was no longer the only danger. The mind began to anticipate attacks, calculate risks, and even dwell on threats that might never arrive. Shadows stretched longer in the imagination than they ever did in the night. Anxiety became a tool as well as a hazard, driving careful movement and deliberate choices, but also consuming energy and attention in ways instinct never had. Survival was no longer guaranteed by speed or strength alone. It required foresight, reasoning, and judgment, skills that were still unevenly distributed among these early humans. Cooperation deepened as instinct lost its dominance. Claws and fangs, once primary means of survival, were replaced by hands capable of precise work, by communication that transmitted strategy across a group. Hunting required planning, dividing labor, and timing attacks. Care for the young, the weak, and the injured was no longer optional. It became a survival imperative. Groups that could not coordinate or share effectively perished quickly. Success now depended as much on social cohesion as on individual skill or courage. The introduction of thought carried its own peril. One miscalculation, one misjudged plan could have catastrophic consequences. A poorly timed migration could leave a band without food. Misreading the terrain or weather could lead to exposure or starvation. Even the creation of a tool involved risk. One sharp edge misused could injure its maker or destroy a resource. Thinking introduced unpredictability into an already unstable equation. Evolution had added a potent new variable, and it could not yet predict whether it would increase survival or hasten extinction. This shift also demanded new forms of learning. Observation alone was insufficient. Memory, abstraction, and imagination became crucial. Mistakes could now ripple beyond the individual, affecting the entire group. Knowledge had to be stored mentally and passed carefully to prevent loss. Oral traditions and rituals began as practical tools, yet they carried the seeds of culture, giving shape to collective intelligence in a fragile and still evolving framework. Imagination opened doors that instinct could never have approached. Humans could anticipate weather, plot hunts across unfamiliar terrain, and create shelters before storms arrived. They could innovate tools, experiment with fire, and test new strategies. Yet every innovation carried risk, because a misapplied idea could threaten the group more than a predator ever could. Planning became a double-edged sword, granting unprecedented power while amplifying the consequences of error. Even social hierarchy shifted under these pressures. Leadership could emerge through insight rather than dominance, and respect could be earned by foresight as well as strength. Groups capable of strategic coordination survived, while those relying on brute force alone dwindled. This marked a decisive departure from prior patterns of evolution, where physical prowess had been the main criterion for survival. In replacing instinct with thought, evolution introduced both freedom and fragility. Humans could now mold their surroundings, shape their own destiny, and pass knowledge across generations, but they were no longer buffered solely by reflex. Every day carried new uncertainties, and each choice carried weight. The species had become conscious of its own vulnerability, aware that misjudgment might not only injure one member, but imperil all. It was a dangerous upgrade, yet necessary. Instinct had guided life for eons, but thought promised a path beyond mere survival. For the first time, the future of a species depended not only on adapting to the world, but on envisioning it, planning for it, and cautiously shaping it. The margin between brilliance and catastrophe had never been thinner, and humans now walked it deliberately, with nothing but each other and their growing intelligence to tip the balance. As thought took root and planning became routine, another quiet transformation began, one that even evolution could not fully oversee. The tools humans created started changing faster than the bodies that wielded them. A sharpened stone, once crude and laborious to make, gave way to finer edges, more complex designs, and techniques that spread across groups faster than genetic traits ever could. Hands that had evolved slowly over millennia now held implements that gave their owners power far beyond what their physical form alone allowed. Biology could not keep pace. Culture began to outstrip the slow rhythm of physical evolution. Knowledge accumulated, stored in memory, and shared through imitation, storytelling, and demonstration. Behaviors, skills, and customs could now survive independently of heredity. Unlike fur or jaw strength, ideas could leap generations instantly, reshaping survival strategies overnight. Social structures, rituals, and cooperative networks allowed humans to occupy environments that no primate had survived without major anatomical change. Learning replaced instinct as the primary adaptive mechanism. In this emerging reality, evolution no longer had sole control. Bodies were still molded by natural selection, but it no longer dictated the species' trajectory entirely. New challenges were often met with ingenuity rather than mutation. Fires were maintained, weapons improved, shelters constructed. Knowledge flowed faster than gene pools could. Evolution had ceded its authority to human innovation, and with that freedom came unpredictability. The species could now manipulate circumstances in ways that no other creature could, sometimes circumventing the pressures that had once sculpted life so meticulously. This shift carried extraordinary risk. Humans were, in essence, experimenting with themselves. Each new invention, each altered behavior had the potential to either enhance survival or introduce disaster. Mastering fire, organizing hunts, storing food, or developing early shelters were all forms of evolution conducted outside the body. The species became a self-directed organism, capable of bending environments to its will, yet fragile in the sense that poor decisions could cascade rapidly across groups. A misapplied idea could not be undone by generations of natural selection. It could annihilate entire populations. Dependency on culture also altered the stakes for social cohesion. Knowledge became a collective asset, and groups that could communicate, teach, and retain information thrived. Those that failed to do so fell behind, sometimes fatally. Leadership, collaboration, and memory were no longer optional traits. They were essential for survival. The survival of one depended upon the attentiveness and intellect of many. Evolution had given humans the foundation, but it was human ingenuity that now determined the course of life. Through this process, humans became architects of their own evolution. Bodies remained important, but they were no longer the sole instruments of survival. Minds, communication, and shared understanding assumed a central role. The species could inhabit cold tundras, arid plains, and dense forests not by growing thicker fur, stronger bones, or sharper claws, but by shaping tools, constructing shelters, and strategizing collectively. Adaptation had shifted from the slow geometry of mutation to the immediate realm of conscious action. Yet the gamble was immense. With evolution's guiding hand loosened, errors carried higher costs. Knowledge could be lost through accident, conflict, or misjudgment. Innovations that failed could imperil entire groups. Unlike physical evolution, which works across countless generations, cultural failure could extinguish hope in a single generation. Humanity was learning that freedom from biological constraint also meant a new kind of vulnerability, one shaped by thought, behavior, and choice, rather than muscle and bone. In surrendering control, evolution allowed humans to surpass it, and in doing so, created a species simultaneously empowered and exposed. The trajectory of survival became an intricate dance of innovation, memory, and foresight. Humans were no longer solely the product of nature. They had become participants in their own creation, walking a path fraught with risk but brimming with possibility. For the first time, the species was not only adapting to the world, it was actively reshaping itself, testing the boundaries of what life could achieve when the rules of biology were no longer absolute. After millennia of relentless change, the pace of physical evolution in humans began to slow, almost imperceptibly. Bodies that had once been reshaped repeatedly by environmental pressure and survival challenges now retained their forms across generations. Limbs, skulls, and internal organs stabilized. The rapid experimentation that had characterized the early stages of hominin development, upright posture, large brains, dexterous hands, gave way to a prolonged period of relative consistency. It was as if evolution, having taken its daring gamble, paused to observe the consequences of its risk. This period of stasis was unusual in the natural world, where the pressure to adapt rarely relents for long. Other species continue to shift, evolve, and vanish. Humans, however, had achieved a level of behavioral and technological sophistication that partially insulated them from the immediate demands of biological change. Clothing, fire, tools, and communal knowledge now mediated survival, buffering bodies from some environmental pressures that might have otherwise driven further physical adaptation. In a sense, evolution had shifted from shaping flesh to shaping culture, from sculpting bodies to influencing the ways humans interacted with their surroundings. Yet, this pause raised profound questions. Stability did not necessarily indicate success. Without the constant push of environmental necessity, the body remained well suited for many conditions, but it did not grow stronger, faster, or more resilient in any dramatic sense. Traits that had once been honed by repeated bottlenecks, the ability to endure cold, hunger, or long migrations, remained largely unchanged. Perhaps the species had reached an optimal balance for its time. Perhaps the equilibrium was temporary, a fragile interlude before the next upheaval arrived. Across the globe, humans faced diverse environments: forests, plains, deserts, mountains. Despite this variety, their anatomy remained remarkably consistent. Variation occurred, but not in ways that fundamentally altered survival capabilities. Teeth, bones, muscles, and brain size had largely reached a plateau. New pressures no longer produced wholesale physical change. Instead, adaptation occurred through ingenuity, social cooperation, and incremental improvements in behavior and technology. Evolution, in effect, had ceded much of its traditional role, observing the experiment it had set in motion while allowing culture to guide immediate outcomes. The silence also highlighted the precariousness of this phase. Humans were now dependent on accumulated knowledge, social networks, and tools for survival. Their bodies, once the primary instruments of endurance, were less able to respond rapidly to extreme stress or sudden environmental shifts without assistance. Disease, famine, or climate volatility could still challenge populations dramatically. The pause in biological innovation did not guarantee immunity from extinction. It only signaled a temporary lull in the planet's relentless testing. Some historians of nature might interpret this stillness as triumph. The species had survived repeated near-extinction events, mastered fire, developed complex social structures, and created tools to extend its reach across continents. Others might see it as a suspenseful interlude, a holding pattern before the next test. Evolution had set the stage for humans to wield unprecedented influence, but it had not removed the underlying vulnerabilities. The experiment was ongoing, and outcomes remained uncertain. For tens of thousands of years, the human form remained a witness to its own stability, a quiet testament to survival amid previously unimaginable odds. Evolution's hand had slowed, yet it had not entirely released its oversight. It was waiting, patient and impartial, to see whether this fragile, intelligent species would continue to thrive, or whether the pause was merely the calm before the storm. In this silence, the story of humans became a narrative of observation, endurance, and cautious expansion. The body no longer demanded constant re-engineering. The mind and culture had become the driving forces of adaptation. And while nature appeared to have stepped back, the world continued to test humanity in subtle, unyielding ways, leaving the ultimate verdict still unresolved. With the slowing of biological evolution, humans began to extend their reach in ways no other species had attempted. They moved into forests, deserts, mountains, and tundras, occupying lands that had once been inhospitable. Where instinct alone had set limits, culture, tools, and collective knowledge now allowed expansion beyond the natural constraints of the body. Every new environment became a testing ground, and every success further reinforced the species' unique capacity to defy the rules that governed other forms of life. As humans spread, they brought unintended consequences. Animals that had evolved in delicate ecological balances suddenly found themselves displaced, hunted, or outcompeted. Entire species vanished quietly, leaving only faint traces in the soil or fossilized remains. Humans did not always intend to eradicate these creatures. Often, survival itself required it. Yet the cumulative effect was profound, a cascade of extinctions that reshaped the world in ways evolution alone had never orchestrated. Habitats changed, predator-prey relationships shifted, and ecosystems were altered almost invisibly, like the gentle yet irreversible turning of a tide. The planet itself began responding to this new force. Forests were cleared, fires were managed or spread unintentionally, and human activity influenced the flow of water and soil. In time, even the climate began to bear the mark of human presence. Local changes in temperature and rainfall occurred as forests were removed or cultivated. Patterns of wind and precipitation subtly shifted in response to alterations in vegetation and the introduction of agriculture. Humans were no longer just inhabitants, they had become active agents in the shaping of their world. This increasing influence carried risk as well as power. Each expansion into a new region presented unknown challenges. Disease could travel faster than anticipated. New predators could appear, and extreme weather could wipe out settlements unprepared for local conditions. Yet despite these dangers, humans continued to move, adapt, and manipulate the environment in a feedback loop of growing complexity. The experiment, which had begun as a fragile primate on the plains of Africa, had now become something almost uncontrollable. The consequences were neither fully understood nor predictable. Cultural innovations and technological advancements spread faster than populations could fully master them. Fires, tools, and early structures amplified human impact, often in ways that were irreversible. Each generation added new layers of influence. creating conditions that no single mind, or even species, could fully comprehend. Nature itself, once the sole arbiter of survival, was now a partner in an unpredictable dialogue, responding to human presence but also shaping the limits of human possibility. By the time humans had reached every continent, the scope of their effect was enormous. Islands and isolated ecosystems that had survived for millennia were suddenly exposed to a species capable of rapid adaptation and persistent pressure. Extinctions became a regular consequence of expansion, and the balance of life shifted in ways that evolution alone could no longer regulate. The delicate checks that had governed natural selection were now supplemented, and sometimes overridden, by intelligence, planning, and ingenuity. It was a dangerous and unprecedented situation. The very traits that had allowed humans to survive, innovation, cooperation, imagination, also made the species capable of overreach. With each conquest of new land or resource, humans were testing boundaries that evolution had not prepared them for. The experiment was no longer confined to small groups or local ecosystems. It had become global, dynamic, and increasingly uncontrollable. In this stage, humans were no longer simply part of the natural order. They had become forces within it, capable of reshaping the rules themselves. Yet the freedom to act so decisively carried uncertainty. The species' own ingenuity could threaten its stability as much as it ensured survival. Expansion had made humans powerful, but it had also amplified the stakes of every choice, turning the ongoing experiment into something far larger and more unpredictable than the sum of its parts. Nature had ceded control, yet it still exerted influence through feedback loops that humans could not fully anticipate. The story of survival had shifted into a story of dominance, responsibility, and risk, a story in which the consequences of action extended far beyond any single lifetime, altering life on Earth in ways that even evolution had not designed. After all the changes, all the near extinctions, and all the inventions, the question of purpose remains. Intelligence emerged slowly, quietly, and at enormous cost. For every advantage it provided, there was an equivalent burden: prolonged childhoods, constant hunger, the weight of imagination, and vulnerability to misjudgment. It is impossible to say whether evolution intended this outcome, or if humans are simply the result of a series of improbable accidents, each compounded by survival against staggering odds. Was the emergence of thought a deliberate masterpiece of natural selection, or a reckless gamble teetering on the brink of failure from the start? Humans stand as evidence of both triumph and uncertainty. The species has endured where instinct alone might have failed. Fire has been harnessed, knowledge shared across generations, and environments transformed to suit the needs of survival. Yet, with every innovation came new risks. Decisions once made in a fraction of a second now carry consequences that can echo across generations. Intelligence has not guaranteed safety, it has amplified responsibility and exposure. Evolution's control has loosened, leaving the trajectory of the species less certain than ever. There is no definitive answer to whether evolution has won or lost. On one hand, a fragile primate that should have disappeared long ago has become the dominant species on the planet. On the other, humans remain vulnerable, subject to the whims of disease, climate, and conflict, their fates intertwined with the very systems they manipulate. The experiment continues, now partially self-directed, and the outcome is still unknown. The line between success and failure has blurred, leaving only a sense of suspense that stretches across millennia. As humans look back, or as we reconstruct the story from a remnants of bones, tools, and fire-scarred Earth, we are left with more questions than answers. Are we the final form of evolution, a species that has reached the pinnacle of adaptation? Or are we a warning, proof of the cost of intelligence, the fragility of life when foresight and recklessness collide? Perhaps these answers will never come. The measure of success may not lie in strength, speed, or size, but in the delicate balance between survival and the awareness of how perilously it was achieved. In reflecting on the journey from fragile primate to world-shaping thinker, there is a quiet beauty to the risk that evolution took. Millions of years of trial, error, near extinction, and innovation converge in humans as both anomaly and continuation. The story is neither fully triumph nor fully cautionary. It exists in the tension between the improbable and the inevitable, a record of a species that was allowed to step outside the usual rules. Perhaps what matters is not certainty but observation. Humans are living evidence that evolution sometimes steps back, allowing behavior, culture, and intelligence to guide the outcome. The gamble has not ended, and the narrative continues in each choice, each adaptation, and each moment of fragile survival. And in that quiet reflection, one can imagine the final note that evolution has left. Perhaps this was not the end of evolution, but the moment it stepped aside. The story lingers softly, inviting contemplation, leaving the listener suspended between awe, mystery, and the enduring rhythm of life continuing in its own unpredictable way.